Hey guys, so this is my recorded lecture for period 4. So this will cover the entire range of topics from 4.1 to 4.14. Doesn't go 100% in chronological order of your book, but this is just following the PowerPoint that you've been shown in class. So period 4 is all about the time period from 1800 to 1848. So we're situated between the Revolution, which is period 3, and the Civil War, which is period 5. So it's this in-between time that I like to call the growing pains of the nation. We've had the first couple presidencies under our belt. And so this is like us starting to, physically expand, testing our powers, testing foreign policy. And all of this kind of adaptation to these changes and the growth of the country will ultimately lead to, this is the growth of democracy and slavery and how that will culminate into, the next unit. So let's get started. All right, so we're going through when you guys did your GDQ. Okay, so we began this unit with reminding ourselves how the political parties had developed at the Constitutional Convention. These two early formations, different factions of people who on the base level disagreed on how much power the federal government should have, what kind of role it should have. That and how much change you're willing to allow are the two fundamental defining characteristics on if you're on the left side of the spectrum, the liberal side, or the right conservative side, where the left liberal side is more pro giving the federal government more power, where the right conservative side is, anti-federal government, hence we have federalists and anti-federalists. However, as those groups started to emerge, even after the formation of the Constitution, there were other issues that seemed to separate them. But what's important to realize is that while the Federalists tend to be located in, New England, Democratic Republicans tend to be located in the South. Federalists, tend to be aligned with like industry, and Democratic Republicans or agriculture. And then who they picked, who they would have sided with in this whole Great Britain versus France conflict. What's important to know is that it's not just because Federalists from the North, that's why they're Federalists. It traces all the way back into the founding of these areas. The fact that the climate and geography of New England lent itself to be industrial based, and the climate and geography of the South and the West tended to be agricultural based. Them having polar opposite economies, that's what shapes their view of the role of government. It is purely because will the government's intervention at this time period, at least not in modern time, but at this time period, will the involvement of the federal government benefit or hurt their economy? Where industry sees it as a potential benefit, they see the government as a potential ally to pass things like tariffs, create the national bank, things that'll help them business wise. Whereas farmers, Democratic Republicans see that as obviously like those biased elitist entities. So it all stems back into what is their regional economy, which just happens to be very North versus South in the United States, at least. So the very first event, it's like the very last event in period 3 and the very first event in period 4, the cutoff point between these two periods is considered the election of Thomas Jefferson, which is also referred to as the Revolution of 1800. So when we see revolution, we're going to broaden our understanding of that term. Revolution just means a significant change. So why is this election considered a revolution? So I also want to make a side note. There are only 4 elections in all of the first unit that you will need to know, 3 of which are in this unit alone. The 4th being in unit 5, the election of Abraham Lincoln. So we're really going to stop and question the significance of the 4 elections, this being the first one. So why is this an issue, or why is this significant rather? So Federalists, if you guys remember in the last unit, have been slowly losing support because they have been acting tyrannical potentially in some of the Democratic Republican eyes. Even some moderates are starting to look at the actions of specifically President John Adams, that second president, who passed these very controversial things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, where he thought he was protecting the country from, France, who seemingly wasn't respecting our neutrality with the XYZ affair. And he was suspicious of French immigrants. So he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which lost him a lot of support. So now we're coming into this election of potentially our third new president, and it ends in a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. John Adams, again, because he lost so much support, he wasn't really in the running anymore. And why this is so important is because it's not even about necessarily who won. It is the fact of kind of how the election played out in terms of there was a tie. And it started to worry people about how the Constitution address this. And they're like, no, don't worry. We planned for this. There's something built within the Constitution that says if there's a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives to settle that dispute. And it's like, oh, well, I guess maybe the Constitution was more stable than we gave it credit for. It was more planned out. So, there was that. But I think the bigger consideration of why it's a revolution is the fact that it is the first peaceful transfer of powers between political parties. Because remember, when the Constitution was being written, yes, those two factions of Federalists and Anti-Federalists were starting to kind of come out of the woodwork and starting to vocalize their opinions, but they weren't these official parties until afterward. And so the Constitution, while it was being written, did not envision a country that was based on a two-party system at all. And so they were afraid of like, how can we go from one president that, like one leader who believed leaned hard to the left side of the political spectrum, now to the guy who leans very hard on the right side of the political spectrum. Like what will happen? Will the country fall apart? And no, guess what? Like, we don't have to be a monarchy. We can have a rotation of power and they can have different political views and the nation won't fall apart. So it set that precedent that peaceful transfer of power between parties is okay. So another reason why it's considered a revolution is because it's a wave of democracy that spread throughout the country when Jefferson is elected president, because his whole shtick as a Democratic Republican, was power to the people. He encouraged average people to get involved in politics. He didn't necessarily see the parties as a horrible thing. It gives you something to rally behind and something to identify with. It increases public involvement in the parties and in politics. But what he's really well known for is expanding suffrage, the right to vote throughout the country. Following his lead, several states, especially the ones out west, are kind of the early ones to do it. The ones who were like newly admitted to the union, those Northwest states, either don't even write property qualifications or religious qualifications in order to vote in their state constitutions. And even older states start to repeal these restrictions that were already built into their state constitutions. So there was kind of an early wave of democracy spreading around the country. So just to kind of reiterate where we are, only like a couple decades after the Treaty of Paris of 1783, where the revolution has ended and the United States, what used to be the colonies, have all the land up into the Mississippi River. So this is kind of where we're at right now. Great Britain is still chilling up here in Canada, and New Spain has made its way all the way up into the central modern day United States. So the major event that happens under this domestic event that happens under Thomas Jefferson, it's super controversial, is the Louisiana Purchase. So let's discuss the timeline of this and why was it considered so controversial. Well, again, from the point of view of a Democratic Republican, they believe that an agrarian society is, what equates freedom. They believe that freedom means that every person has their own plot of land and that agriculture is the future of the economy, not industry in the North. And Thomas Jefferson fully believes that, but that requires a substantial amount of land. And so if you look back, at this map, we said that, Spain has this area, but Napoleon Bonaparte, who is the current dictator of France, is able to strong arm that land, this Louisiana territory, which is essentially this whole central part of the modern day United States. They strong arm that from Spain. So France is now our next door neighbors again. Why we care about that is because it ruined Pinckney's Treaty. If you remember that from towards the end of Unit 3, that was our treaty with Spain that allowed us access to this port that is at the bottom of the Mississippi River, which is crucial for trade. The Mississippi River is huge for transportation. And so allowing us access to that port, was really pivotal for our economy. And now that just got overturned because there are new owners of it. So Thomas Jefferson and other Congress members start to discuss possibly purchasing maybe the port, the area around the port, and it slowly expands to, why don't we just offer, a chunk of money for that entire piece of land, because Napoleon Bonaparte of France is still fighting Great Britain. That fight that we've been talking about ever since the last unit is still going on and will go on for a long time. France and Great Britain are like mortal enemies in the background, like frenemies. And so we're like, you know what? They're distracted. They probably don't want to actually oversee this land, even though they just got it. So why don't we just make an offer? And they offered 15 million for the entire area, and it sold. It was such a steal. It more than doubled the size of the US. It was less than 13 cents an acre. This entire plot of land. So why was this so controversial? Well, the link at the bottom, unfortunately, of this slide leads to a piece of a documentary that for some reason is no longer accessible on YouTube. But this video that used to do such a great job expressing why this was so controversial is because there is nothing in the Constitution that says that the president or even Congress has the ability to purchase land, to purchase federal land. Now, even though the majority of the country will kind of turn a blind eye and support this decision because they believe that it was so valuable to the country, it still shows that the same guy, the leader, creator of the Democratic Republican Party, the guy that was so anti-federal government power, pro states' rights, pro power to the people, that was getting all over Hamilton for taking a loose interpretation of the Constitution in order to create the national bank, because it did not say that in the Constitution that he could do that, is now taking that exact same perspective, that same loose interpretation of the Constitution in order to justify purchasing the Louisiana Purchase territory. So that is why it's so controversial, but no one is going to necessarily stop the purchase. Even Federalists who are going to call him a hypocrite do agree that this is super beneficial. There's a lot of raw materials and resources to be had out there. It'll expand our economy. So no one's going to necessarily stop it, but they do want to point out the hypocrisy of this. So there is a great worksheet that you guys were given, the Assessing Jefferson's Presidency, which aims at one of the big takeaways of this topic in your AMSCO book about Thomas Jefferson, assessing the extent to which he upheld his democratic Republican ideals and really lived up to this Jeffersonian democracy title. Because that's the whole point of Jefferson's presidency. That's the big learning target they want you to understand, is how he expanded, in what ways did he expand democracy, and potentially in what ways he did not. So if you feel confident that you can speak on this, and you guys submitted thesis statements for this assignment, then you guys are set there. So then we're leading into the next part, where it's going into the next presidencies. So this Marbury versus Madison is going a little farther back to where Jefferson is actually becoming president. So we're going back to the night before he takes office, where John Adams, the Federalist president number 2, is about to leave, and he's within his right to appoint federal judges. That is part of his president, as or his powers, president, the leader of the executive branch. And John Adams appoints what people call midnight judges, because they are so last minute in his appointees in his final days of office. And he is asking James Madison, writer of the Constitution, the future president, he asks him to deliver these, essentially the letters that are kind of like a job offer. These people have already been told they're getting the job. They've already been approved. The whole process has been completed, essentially. It's just the formality of getting the slip of paper. And there is kind of a delay. And Thomas Jefferson comes in the next day to take his his first day on the job, and sees that there are still some appointments that had not been delivered, and halts them. And it makes sense. I mean, John Adams is the opposite party. He's going to obviously appoint Federalists to these high-ranking positions. And Thomas Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, is probably not too keen on that. And so he stops it. Now, Marbury is one of the people who just did not get his appointment in time. And so he's going to sue James Madison to basically hand it over, to deliver it. And it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the thing is, this case is not about Marbury. It is not about whether he gets his job or not. It is about the decision itself. So, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, declared, yeah, Marbury probably should get his job, but he took it a step further and said, you know what? We're discussing, like, should he get the job or not by assessing the language of the Judiciary Act of 1789. And you know what? I don't even think that the Judiciary Act of 1789 should have even been written in the first place. This act, which gives, it kind of gave multiple powers. We don't get too much into the weeds, but it gave multiple powers, partly of, who gets to appoint these judges and who gets to confirm the appointments, like the Supreme Court being able to confirm the appointments, all this stuff. But essentially, what you need to know is that John Marshall took the extra step to question the constitutionality of this act written by Congress years before, and decided, I actually don't think that that was constitutional. So this whole thing is kind of a moot point. We can't even decide if Marbury gets his job or not, because I don't think that we should have even been granted the power to weigh in on this from this Judiciary Act. And it set that crucial precedent of judicial review. The fact that the Supreme Court can check the constitutionality, it gets to check the Congress and the legislative branch, because at its inception, the Supreme Court, as like the head of the judicial branch, was originally created just to check state constitutions, to make sure that they were kind of maintaining the balance of what's in state constitution versus what's in the federal government's purview. But this is the time where they set the precedent by exhibiting that same power against another federal level branch. It puts them on the same level essentially as the other two branches. So pretty much this is the most important Supreme Court case of all time, because it set the precedent for all their future Supreme Court cases. Because almost every other Supreme Court case that we will, essentially, most of the ones we'll focus on in this class, deal with a federal law. Some will deal with state laws, though that might come into, more when we talk about the issue of civil rights. But many of the Supreme Courts, the landmark Supreme Court cases that we weigh in on this course, tend to be them checking potentially a federal law. So there is a study guide of all Marshall Supreme Court cases that is linked for you on Canvas that I think we would find very helpful. We don't focus on a whole lot of Supreme Court cases throughout our entire course. The reason why we hyper focus on Marshalls is just because, again, we're in the beginning stages of our country. There's a lot of landmark cases that happen because a lot of precedents are being set. So you don't need to know the whole description of what happened in the cases, as long as you understand the crucial precedent that was set by them. How some, like Gibbons versus Octon, and some of the others about, how the government can, oversee interstate commerce, or, all these kind of things. That is the key takeaways, that you understand some of these major precedents that were set. But aside from this chunk, there's not a whole lot of other Supreme Court cases that we focus on. So you really want to make sure you understand why these are significant, and they will come back. They will be cited in other units. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase was like, the one major significant domestic issue, but in the background, Napoleon Bonaparte, was continuing to fight with Great Britain in what's called the Napoleonic Wars. It's the same old fight between France and Great Britain. We just call it the Napoleonic Wars because this is just the time in which Napoleon was the leader of France. And so this small section of this ongoing conflict that's been going on for decades is called the Napoleonic Wars. So how will Thomas Jefferson hand this ongoing issue? Because remember, Washington's whole deal was neutrality. We're going to maintain neutrality. John Adams tried to do that by, with trying to send ambassadors to France, and it turned into the XYZ affair. And now it's Thomas Jefferson trying to hold up the mantle and maintain neutrality. The problem is that same old crap is still happening, where we have impressment, where mainly Great Britain is the one doing this, where they basically kidnap our ships and our men aboard and put them into their own military and steal the resources on board. They're blockading each other. France and Great Britain are blockading each other. Again, tends to be Great Britain blockading France, just because Great Britain has the military, the Navy, to do that. And why that affects us is because not only are our neutral ships getting kidnapped in the process, but now we're just kind of floating outside of France going, hey, we just want to dock and trade, but now we can't. And again, it tends to be Great Britain. So we're starting to get a little bit more upset with them. And it only gets worse when one of our neutral ships is open fired upon in the Chesapeake Leopard affair, where the USS Chesapeake gets shot at by the British ship, the Leopard, where that, again, in the US press, it looks horrific. It looks like a call to action, but we still feel that we are a baby nation. It is not right to get involved just yet. We are still trying to preach neutrality. So Thomas Jefferson's single attempt to do this before he left office was the Embargo Act. He was hoping that instead of a strong show of force to potentially lead to war, we could apply some economic pressure. So an embargo means a ban on trade. So the Embargo Act of 1807, and you need to know the year for this one, just because there are other embargo acts, even though AMSCO might not cite any others, there are other textbooks, so we need to clarify which one we're talking about. The Embargo Act of 1807 forbade the American ships from trading with any other nation. I know this sounds silly. We were hoping that us cutting off our trade from the rest of the world would eventually convince France and Great Britain that they need us so bad to trade with that they will just respect our neutrality. In reality, they just went to other nations to get similar or the same products, and it only tragically hurt our economy. So James Madison is president number 4 coming in, the father of the Constitution, and how is he going to handle this continuing issue? So the two things that happen under Madison are the Non-Intercourse Act and Makin's Bill number 2. You do not need to know the year for the Non-Intercourse Act. There's only one. So it's just commonly referred to as the Non-Intercourse Act. And if you really break down the name, non-intercourse means that you're not engaging with them. And so basically we're trying to uphold neutrality, keep that same idea of economic pressure, but don't kill the US economy in the process. So the US can trade with any nation except Great Britain and France until they agree to respect our neutrality. But it still is hurting our economy very badly because our two best trading partners are France and Great Britain. So even though we can open up trade with the rest of the world, it is still not enough. And it's really hurting our trade industry, which is, again, located in the north, tends to be aligned with the Federalist Party. And so it tends to be a very partisan issue on if you are, a little bit more aggressive in your stance of, sticking up to these foreign nations, how you feel about these economic pressures. Makin's Bill number 2 try to repeal it just a little bit more. And we said, you know what? They want us to pick a side. Okay, we'll let them pick our side. We'll reinstate trade with whatever nation, Great Britain or France, whoever agrees to respect our neutrality first, and we'll stop trading with the other one. Napoleon of France was the first one to jump and say, I'll do it. However, shortly after, they still continue with the same old stuff. Our ships are still being impressed. And so it just backfires. So what is a poor US nation to do where seemingly no one's respecting us? We don't have the teeth, like we don't have the capital, the muscle to enforce anything, to scare anyone. We don't have the ability to do these economic pressures. So what are we going to do? Well, eventually this is going to lead into the War of 1812, our first war as a new nation. A lot of historians will call this almost as Revolution 2.0 because it's us versus Great Britain again, this new nation with still not a whole lot of resources, a very fragile new government against the most powerful nation in the world with the most highly trained military, endless resources, a lot of capital, a lot of money. So we're not going to get into the whole fighting of it. But we will focus on the causes and effects. So the 3 main causes of the War of 1812 are what we've been really talking about. We just want to be able to sail around and trade and not worry about our ships being taken. Simple as that. Not hard to ask for. Now, something that is kind of happening in the back of American citizens' minds is the potential for, if we fought Great Britain on our turf. You can see that British Canada up here is in, I won't say our backyard, but our next door neighbor. And potentially we could win more land from them. And who in the United States would really love more land? those Southern Democratic Republicans, people who believe in that agrarian society. And so they see this as a potential land grab if they win. Also, that's what been happening in the background. I know I mentioned this in the beginning or within the last unit that this was happening, but this is where it culminates. The fact that we're still having issues with the natives and the frontier. Well, the Battle of Tippecanoe is one where native forces are attacking American citizens, like our outposts, and General William Henry Harrison, future president, puts them down. However, and he does become famous for this Battle of Tippecanoe. However, we see that amongst the kind of remnants of the battle, British weaponry being left, amongst the like the debris or something, I don't want to say it, which seemingly is pointing to the fact that Great Britain has not only not abandoned their military outposts out west that they were supposed to, according to the Treaty of Paris, 1783, but they are arming the natives and inciting them to attack us. And so clearly that's violating our neutrality, it's violating our sovereignty, our independence as a nation. And so with all of this, it's leading to war hawks in Congress. War hawks is a general term for very pro-war, vocal, aggressive folks. And at this point, these are the land-hungry Democratic Republicans who are, possibly being impacted by these natives on the frontier. Already very anti-Great Britain because, Democratic Republicans are like leaning more towards France. And again, see this as a potential way to win more land. When it gets into the next election and James Madison is up for re-election, the big ticket item between the two candidates was, should we go to war or not? Where James Madison is saying, the Democratic Republican is saying yes, whereas Clinton, no relation to the Clinton you guys think of, Federalist is saying no. So you can see it's a very partisan, based on a regional economy issue on if you wanted to go to war or not. So in terms of the actual fighting, your book goes into way more depth than we need. The only things I care about are this, just because, again, it'll have a lasting effect. So Great Britain will employ the same strategy that it did to France, to us. They'll use their impressive navy to blockade ports, mainly New England, so we can't get aid. It makes it harder for us to transport our supplies, in and out. And so New England is going to have to rapidly industrialize to meet that wartime demand. There are a few, battles that are happening within the country. We have the Battle of the Thames River, where future President William Henry Harrison becomes a war hero. We have Andrew Jackson, who wins the Battle of New Orleans in the South, becomes a famous war hero. The famous burning of the White House, where Francis Scott Key, who witnesses this tragic event, but sees it as an opportunity to rally the nation, writes the Star Spangled Banner as an optimistic view of the nation being able to rebuild and come together after, a very difficult war. Again, the odds are stacked against us, so it was supposed to be this inspirational, rallying cry that, we still use today. So with that, that's the only part of like the actual, piece of the fighting. Yes, we're going back and forth, almost playing tug of war with the border between us and Canada, but it ultimately ends in 1814, 2 years after it began, with the Treaty of Ghent, which ends in a stalemate because there's no clear winner. No one is really gaining or losing anything. It's just a drainage on both sides' resources. Great Britain is still fighting France back in Europe, and they're just, so they can't really focus on us anymore. And so they agreed to the ending of a stalemate. The problem is the treaty addresses none of the causes of the war, says nothing about neutrality, nothing about impressment, nothing about paying, the US back. All the territory that was won by either side goes back to its pre-war owners, pre-war boundaries. So from kind of like a bird's eye view, you're like, why bother? This war seemingly was for nothing. Even though on paper it looks like it was for nothing, there are some serious repercussions of this war on the nation's, like our nation's development. The first one being the end of the Federalist Party. So as we said, leading up to the war, Federalists were very anti-war because we were potentially about to attack their number one trading partner. It could really hurt their industry, hurt their economy. And the Hartford Convention is basically synonymous with the dying of the Federalist Party, because this is one of their biggest meetings where the most radical of the Federalists met in New England to even discuss secession as a potential solution, since the federal government was not listening to them about their their anti-war stance. The problem is this seemed very not patriotic for the Federalist Party, and they become synonymous, with being un-American. And then, by the end of the war, no one really wants to identify as a Federalist because of this reputation that they have. In the background, we also have the fact that the country was so split on if we should go to war or not. Before this, it only required a simple majority for Congress to be able to declare war. This is where we see the new how we have it today, where Congress needs at least 2/3 of a vote in order to declare war. So it needs like a higher standard before it can happen. The U.S. gets respect from other nations. I mean, we held our own against the most powerful nation for at least 2 years, so that's got to be something. And that's going to give us a lot of pride and patriotism. That's what nationalism is referring to in our country. The idea of secession, kind of what I talked about up here with the Federalists, the idea of secession has come up now as a potential solution. And I mentioned in the last unit with the idea of nullification being brought up, and we'll see it again later in this unit. Nullification and secession are very radical notions, and the fact that they keep getting brought up as potential solutions when a state or a party does not like something the federal government is doing is a very radical response, and it'll only grow and culminate into the Civil War in the next unit. The war heroes rose to prominence. That's why we only focus on, these specifically battles, and because these key players become famous and will eventually be elected president because of their efforts. And lastly, the only reason why I mentioned the blockading here is because with New England having to meet the wartime demand, they had to become very self-sufficient very fast, and they radically industrialized at a much more rapid pace than they would have before. And so we'll see the creation of the first industrial revolution, mainly in New England, as a result of the War of 1812 very shortly. So then I introduced this era right after the War of 1812, which is roughly the 10 years after the war, called the era of good feelings. It's going to span maybe like the 2 terms that President Monroe is in office. Democratic Republican, James Monroe is elected, because again, there's no Federalists on the ballot anymore. They're gone. And again, from a bird's eye view, it seems like a time period where there's a lot of patriotism, nationalism, pride in our country, growth, wanting to improve everything, unity. But you guys have that whole activity called Nationalism on the Rise, where you're supposed to take a more critical look at these specific key events to determine, is this really a time period of nationalism, or do you see some early hints of sectionalism? And sectionalism broadly means anything that promotes division. However, we're going to reserve that term usually for only regional divides, which also, because of the way the U.S. is set up, the regional economies also tend to be very bi-party. It's a very partisan thing as well. So those are kind of synonymous. Anything that divides the party tends to also divide the North and South from each other. So that is the key takeaway of topic, I believe it's 4.3 in your book, is the idea of nationalism. So you being able to critically analyze these certain events to determine if they're nationalistic and to what extent. One event can have hints of both, and that's totally fine. Maybe the intentions were more nationalistic, but it didn't pan out that way for everyone. And so some of the things on your sheet were looking at like the tariffs that are passed. And again, they're passed with good intentions of promoting American industry. The tariff of 1816 was a super high tariff, the first protective tariff, essentially, which was, again, it was not passed to raise revenue. That's what they kind of mean by that. It was the only reason for it was to promote American business, make foreign products more expensive. The problem is this is the first tariff where New England is the one seemingly getting upset about it as well, because the things that were being tariffed were things that were also needing to be imported by New England. So that's why this is probably one of the only tariffs that will say that New England actually was not super keen on it as well. But the Southerners were also still not keen on it, never are keen on tariffs because they're the ones who usually have to pay it. Then you have Henry Clay's American system, which is very reminiscent of Alexander Hamilton's three-part plan to get the nation out of debt after the revolution: protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements by state governments where the government could maybe subsidize it, provide federal aid in order for government or state governments to build infrastructure, build up their economy, kind of get back on their feet so they can just move forward. But that puts more onus on the federal government to possibly assume more debt. One of the other things on your sheet was the changes in the Democratic Republican Party, which is it can be a little complicated because, again, from a bird's eye view, the Federalist Party seemingly disappeared. And some historians like to point to that as, wow, that means that we only had one party. That means that the nation must have been united for once if everyone belongs to the same party. But when we look closer, a lot of primary sources reveal like the Federalists didn't just evaporate when their party disbanded. They just didn't know what to call themselves because they didn't want to be seen as un-American, because that's what Federalist was kind of synonymous with at the time. So they identified as Democratic Republicans because that was the only option on the ballot. So in reality, while on paper everyone's a Democratic Republican, there's kind of two sub-factions: the old Democratic Republicans, the original, the OG Democratic Republicans that believe in the limited government, strict interpretation of the Constitution, and new Democratic Republicans, which are the Federalists at heart that advocate for the national bank, the tariffs, more power to the federal government, all that stuff. We'll get more into the causes of the Western settlement into the next unit. But your book talks about, there's a lot of immigration during this time, mainly from German and Irish immigrants. And because of that, we're starting to expand into the West a lot faster because immigrants coming in actually want to get more farm area more than anything else. And so they're the ones actually settling some of the Midwestern land early. That's why we have some of these Midwestern cities out here, like Chicago, being very and it's a very Irish dominated, very Irish influenced, like in terms of its history, city. If you weren't aware of that from the city of Chicago's history. So because of that, the government is promoting, or is selling this land off cheap to encourage migration, and they can make money, but that also calls for more transportation in order to get out there. And so it's kind of like what came first, chicken or the egg? They're kind of feeding each other in terms of westward expansion and more inventions. Now, the problem is, and we'll revisit this in the next unit, as we start incorporating more land, an issue that gets basically applied to all new land acquisitions is this issue between the representation of free versus slave states in Congress. Congress is the most important branch in their eyes. It's Article 1 of the Constitution. They're the lawmakers. They determine the fate of the country. And so with the Louisiana Purchase territory, the first state that applied for statehood to the Union was Missouri. And at that point, it's kind of, mainly like Democratic Republicans in the South. It's going to be a slave state. But currently, there is a balance right now between the free states and the slave states in terms of their representatives in Congress. And so the Missouri Compromise proposed by Henry Clay, the same guy that wrote the American system, believe that maybe to maintain that balance, we have to also admit a free state. Hence, Missouri is going to be admitted as a slave state, Maine up here as a free state to keep that balance, that 2-2 balance in at least the Senate. But in order to just kind of put a band-aid on the issue for the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory, which is seemingly going to become many more states soon, they're just going to draw this arbitrary line at the 3630 line, this line of latitude, and everything north of it, all other future states other than Missouri, will just be automatically free, and everything south of it will be automatically slave. The big foreign policy thing during this time is Monroe Doctrine, where we are all amped up after the War of 1812. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves. And we realize that European nations will not stop colonizing the Western Hemisphere. They will not stop, violating our neutrality. And so in this kind of moment of patriotism and pride and possibly arrogance, and maybe stupidity, the United States kind of puffs up its chest to the rest of the world and says, hey, Europe, they were basically just talking to Europe at this point. You can keep your colonies that you've made in the Western Hemisphere. Like recently, Russia just colonized Alaska. Like, fine, keep your colonies, but we will not tolerate any further colonization. Do not try to extend any more of your political influence in our own hemisphere. We won't get involved in your affairs. Don't get involved in ours. Again, it's just a very big show of confidence, asserting our independence because of this nationalism that we're feeling in the era of good feelings. But it's upholding that idea of neutrality. Like, you don't get involved in our stuff. We don't get involved in yours. Okay, so now we're getting into the Industrial Revolution. Like I said, as a result of the War of 1812, we had to meet that wartime demand, and New England catapulted with this shift towards machinery. And that's what the Industrial Revolution means. Industrial means a shift towards machinery, not craftsmanship, away from handmade things, like towards using machinery, mechanizing, and standardizing industry. So we're starting to see this development of a national economy, again, with the growth of our immigration, because natural population increases, we're getting more of a workforce, and also just with natural population increase and the immigration, we're moving out west. So we're starting to incorporate all this new land, and that just fuels the economy with all these new resources. But like I said earlier, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg. With this new land incorporation, we need to create infrastructure to get out there. We need roads, we need canals, we need railroads, steamboats, all these new inventions. So they're created to help us move out west, and then it encourages more people to move out west. But then we just end up creating, more inventions like on the back end to, further encourage more people to come out, to ship things back to the eastern cities, like the eastern industries. So it's just kind of like a mutually benefiting symbiotic relationship between westward expansion and the advancement of technology. So some of the key inventions of the time are the Erie Canal, that man-made waterway. We see the beginning of expansion of railroads, the steamboat, the telegraph for communication, all which promote business. The other big inventions are both created by Eli Whitney here, and we have this creation of interchangeable parts and the cotton gin. Interchangeable parts will really benefit New England. The cotton gin will revolutionize the South. Interchangeable parts is the first step into the ability to do mass production. Interchangeable parts not only allows for the machinery itself to be built based on smaller, potentially exchangeable pieces. If something breaks down, you don't have to replace the whole machine. But then even the product itself could be made up of small, consistent parts to be churned out by machines. And if you have interchangeable parts, that can lead towards an assembly line kind of mentality. So it's where we start to see it slightly. We don't get the mass assembly line for a while until we get to, Henry Ford in the 20s, but we're starting to see that mentality of simplifying, standardizing products, not going away from craftsmen and unique hand, I would say, I guess, craftsman style products. So the cotton gin, as we'll talk about a little more in a second, is what revolutionizes the South. But another example of this shifted industry are like the textile mills in the New England area. There's these like spinning looms that can, an actual person needs to be running the machine, but it spins cotton, or like cotton from the South gets sent to these textile mills in the North, and they can spin this cotton faster to make textiles. So it makes that process a lot faster. But the Lowell system is a good example of how businesses adapt to the change in this technology in order to meet the rising demand. The Lowell system was a system where they had young unmarried women live and work simultaneously in the factory to save costs and encourage more production. So with the invention of the cotton gin, we start seeing this expansion of cotton as the new cash crop. It is bigger than tobacco ever has, ever will be. Cotton just blows the profit of it out of the water. That's why the South refers to it as, quote, king cotton. Cotton is king. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the next unit as well, because of how it just completely just expanded the demand for slaves and how that will increase political tensions between the North and the South. But with this new cash crop and the government promoting westward expansion, Southerners can get that land that they need to harvest this labor-intensive, land-hungry crop. It needs an expansive amount of land in order to get a lot of it, in order to make it worthwhile. And the cotton gin just sped up the production of it. So while we think of it as, oh, that would require less slaves, no, in terms of like meeting the demand and with the expansion of how much land they have, and to meet the demand, it will just fuel the demand for slaves, which is all leading up to the market revolution. So in class, I explained the difference between the Industrial Revolution and the market revolution in a more simplistic ways in the book. Industrial Revolution is just the shift towards inventions, machinery to do things. That's all that means. The market revolution, market just means the economy, buying and selling. So the market revolution is, how did the economy change as a result of having these inventions, of having this machinery? How did this just change how people lived and how businesses operate? So for instance, if the spinning mill is the Industrial Revolution, the Lowell system is the market revolution. That's how businesses adapt to the machinery that they were provided. If the cotton gin is the Industrial Revolution, the demand for more slaves, the growth of slavery, is the market revolution. So the market revolution and the activity that you looked at showed all these continuities and changes, that there's even more than I could even write here, but some of the ones you might have picked up on are the fact that certain regions of the country are becoming more specialized in what they do, and just more dependent on each other, because if you can just transfer goods and people throughout the country, there's not really a need for you to diversify your economy. Standards of living are going to increase with new technology. Women are going to start finding jobs outside the household. Granted, they tend to be more gender-based jobs, but they're still exerting more control over their lives than ever before. There's more social mobility. And so the gap between the rich and the poor, it will actually kind of fluctuate. The gap between the rich and the poor, I would say your book can be a little misleading. It says that in some parts of the book, it says it lessened, in some parts it grew. So just to kind of clarify, again, some of the documents in this activity speak a little bit to this, where you almost see a development of a middle class. And so I would say to clarify this discrepancy in the book, that there are more classes, more levels of wealth being made. So it's not as much of a stark difference, meaning that it's closing that gap, but it does not mean that the whole country is like becoming more rich. So hopefully that makes sense, that there is more levels within the class system that you can fall on, but that does not necessarily mean that the rich did not get richer and the poor didn't get poorer. There's still a wide range of potential class hierarchy. The market revolution inquiry activity, I would highly recommend, if you did not finish that, to go and finish that. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of this unit with Andrew Jackson as president. So we're getting into the 20s here, just so we can start the story of Jackson. Is we're getting to that once he's actually elected, the end of the 1820s. So how and why did the US shift towards more democratic practices during this age of democracy? Why is this considered the age of democracy in American history? So starts with the election of 1824. So because the Federalists are no longer in existence, we have 4 Democratic Republican candidates on the ballot. And this is the first time in history where the popular vote did not align with the electoral vote outcome. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but the electoral votes were actually divided equally between, like there was a tie, I should say, not just equally, but tie between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, Federalist president, our second president. So also it should be mentioned that while Andrew Jackson is one of those original diehard Democratic Republicans, John Quincy Adams is just like his dad, who's a Federalist, but because there's no Federalist name to identify with, that he is a Democratic Republican. So they are actually kind of polar opposite on the political spectrum. So what happened with this, with this tie? Well, as the Constitution states, kind of like what happened with Thomas Jefferson, it goes to the House of Representatives to determine a tie. Now, what happened behind closed doors is later kind of revealed to the public. Unfortunately, that a corrupt bargain was struck. Henry Clay, the same guy that wrote the American System and Missouri Compromise, he keeps coming back a lot in this unit. Henry Clay went to John Quincy Adams and said, I can get people to vote for you. I can swing support in your way if you make me your Secretary of State when you become president. And that's exactly what happened. So while, yes, this is the first time the popular vote didn't align with the electoral vote, like the first time, but then also seemingly the second time, like they could have voted to uphold the popular vote, but the government did it. So if imagine you're just a average Joe in the country and you see this happening, and that realization washes over you to where, wait, I don't actually have a direct say in who's the president. Remember, these people weren't privy to all the writing of like the Constitution and all of its stipulations and compromises. They weren't aware of the whole debate about the rule of the mob and the Electoral College. And so the corrupt bargain seemingly rocked the public to thinking the federal government really was elitist, and it was biased, it was corrupt, and they will remember that in the next election. Now, the one thing that we need to know about John Quincy Adams' presidency is the tariff of 1828, this super high tariff that he promoted, again, because he's like one of those old school Federalists at heart. He promoted this tariff that was so high, the Southerners denounced it and called it the tariff of abominations, meaning it's like the tariff from hell. And I mention this because it'll come to a head under Andrew Jackson's presidency. So we started this conversation in class about this famous portrait of Andrew Jackson, of how he's portrayed. You can see that he is, smoking a stogie and just normal clothes, not like a 3-piece suit, kicking it back in the woods, at his cabin. This is not an elitist. This is not a wealthy individual. This is not, an unapproachable figure. He's supposed to be kind of one of the guys. I kind of joked in class that it's kind of like when everyone looked at George W. Bush and said, he's someone I can have a beer with. That's kind of Jackson's thing as well. Like, he wanted to emphasize, like, I'm one of you. Like, he is the first president that did not go to college. He was born poor and proud of it. Rags to riches story and war hero, self-made man. So it's like in the next election, more than ever, the public is determined to get Jackson elected because they feel like a win for him is a win for like America. Because again, he represents them. He is the common guy. So the election of 1828 is the second of the 4 elections of the first semester that you will need to know. And notice why it's called a revolution as well. So John Quincy Adams and Jackson, what's notable about this election is that they actually both run smear campaigns against each other. They both criticize each other in the press in order to tear the other down. And it kind of started this early shift in politics where it made it like a form of entertainment. And you guys are probably familiar with that as well. Like, you guys see political memes all the time about Trump and Biden. That's not new, but it was not common back in this time. It started with this election. And it really increased voter turnout. So voter turnout it far surpassed anything in the previous years. So one, because politics became like a mainstream entertainment. but also because they wanted Jackson as president. They believed in this common man, like to get him into office was like a win for the common man. So based on his reputation, he's elected in, and it's considered a win for the people. So I want to compare these two elections, the election of 1800 and the election of 1828. Both were Democratic Republican presidents that were elected, that both preached power to the people. That is why they're both considered, a main reason why they're both considered revolutions is because what follows both of them is a wave of democracy. Hence why it's Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. They're the only presidents that have this revolution word in front of their elections and the word democracy after their last names. So these two elections and these two revolutions go hand in hand. So there is a slew of reasons of why this is considered the age of democracy. Andrew Jackson was very opposed to federal spending. He believed that if there was a bill that talked about the federal government spending more money, it usually was synonymous with the government getting too powerful. If they're spending money, that means that they're getting involved in something, that means they're getting their hands involved in something, and he didn't like that, which led him to vetoing upwards of 12 bills at the end of his presidency. So let's stop and think about why it's so crazy during this time period. 12 bills is more than all the other previous presidents combined at this point. Each president was like one, I think at most 2 bills by this point, and he vetoed 12. I know it's a little weird for us today because we have upwards of 300 per president in modern times, but that's pretty significant because early presidents were super hesitant to use the power of the veto. Because when you think about it, when you think of the process that a bill has to go through to become a law, that's a long process, and it goes through a lot of hands, a lot of compromises. It's been seen by a lot of people. It's gone through both houses of Congress, meaning that typically large and small states, set now north and south, industrial versus agriculture, by the time it's reached the president's desk, it has been wordsmithed to a point where it's pretty agreed upon. And then for one singular person just to go no and veto it seems kind of undemocratic, a little tyrannical. And so the power of the veto was supposed to be reserved for very specific, cases or where the president felt very strongly. And so while Jackson might see his vetoing as him protecting the people, because it might be a bill about federal spending, some people might view that exact same thing as an abuse of power. So it's kind of up to interpretation. The third point, the expansion of universal white male suffrage, is one of the big buzz terms for this unit. Universal white male suffrage means that by the end of Jackson's presidency, every white guy can vote. There are no religious or property requirements to vote in any state after his presidencies. We started seeing that. That's one of the big reasons why Jefferson's presidency is called Jeffersonian democracy, which I just mentioned earlier. Property qualifications and religious qualifications were slowly being repealed in the western states, and we started seeing it in other states. And then Jackson just continued that trend. He really promoted it. He believed that everyone should have the right to vote, no matter their education, their wealth, their status, all that. We also see party nominating conventions replacing caucuses. Caucuses are considered, at a very basic explanation, caucuses are like closed door meetings where politicians essentially select other politicians to become candidates for president. Where party nominating conventions are considered open door forums where people can go in and vocalize who they want the final candidates for president to be. So rather than you showing up at the 2020 election being, all right, here are your two choices, Biden or Trump, and then you had no say up to that point about those are just your two choices. You're like, oh, well, wish I had a say earlier. Party nominating conventions are what starts that trend. The election of electors is a big thing. The rise of third parties. Your book, I think, specifically mentions the Masonic Party and the Working Men's Party. The Working Men's Party is probably the more well-known one because it's a great example of the fact that common people are starting to take the initiative to get their voices heard. They felt very empowered under Jackson, that they had the right to get their voices heard. And if they didn't feel like they were forming their own political party yeah, it may not have gotten a whole lot of traction, but they're forming third parties, they're forming interest groups to get that word out there to try to get change for themselves. There's just more elected offices available, more positions being created in local, state, and federal offices. Popular campaigning is a trend that we'll talk about in a second. That'll be a big one in after Jackson. And the spoil system and rotation office are two things that Jackson preached. Now, the spoil system is not a super democratic move. The spoil system, it refers to the phrase "to the victor goes the spoils," meaning that the winner gets to reap the benefits. And so this is not an unheard of trend. It's probably not going to shock you that when you become president, you get to appoint your buddies into positions. It's not like the cabinet, how the president gets to appoint their their executive branch or the executive departments, administration, or sorry, like I should say secretaries of his administrative departments. So that should not be a surprise. Again, it does not mean the person's necessarily the best person for the job, but you're going to appoint people of your party, appoint people that you like. The rotation in office is a democratic trend. Rotation in office is kind of upholding that same idea that Washington started, that you shouldn't stay in one position for too long. You should rotate people out, because if you're in a position for too long, you become stale, complacent, possibly corrupt, greedy, and power hungry. So we want to keep rotating people in and out. So there are three events under Jackson that you need to be familiar with. The first one is the treatment of Native Americans. So Andrew Jackson, again, from the point of view as a Southern Democratic Republican, believes in an agrarian society just like Jefferson did. And he's siding with these land-hungry Americans in the South who want to move out westward, but their frontier is seemingly blocked by the natives in the area. So Jefferson proposes the Indian Removal Act, and Congress approves it. It forcibly resettles thousands of Native Americans onto reservations farther out west. And again, keep in mind, these reservations, the land that was reserved for them is not necessarily the best land, and that they did not want to go. The Trail of Tears is the very well-known act of forcibly removing them, where federal forces, like armed forces, escorted, I'll use that term very loosely, escorted 15,000 Cherokee Indians from Georgia to Oklahoma to resettle them. Many primary accounts of what happened talked about how many Native Americans died of starvation and disease or brutality along the trail. So, there were attempts at natives to try to stop this. The Cherokee Nation v. Georgia is a Supreme Court case where the Cherokee Nation tried to stop this and fight for their right to stay. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court case doesn't really go anywhere because the Supreme Court dismisses it and says, this isn't really a real case because you're not real citizens. So you don't have the ability to sue anyone or be heard in this courtroom. So that unfortunately set the precedent for years that Native Americans they don't even have an avenue to advocate for their rights because they can't even be using the court system. Worcester versus Georgia it's sided with the natives. I'm not saying that because they thought that the natives, should be stood up for. It wasn't out of the goodness of their heart. It was questioning the constitutionality of this decision. Does Georgia have the ability to do that in terms of what is granted to them in the Constitution? And it goes up to Supreme Court Justice John Marshall again, and he weighs in on the decision and says, you know what? I don't think that Georgia has the constitutional right to forcibly move thousands of residents into another state. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. Jackson took a very, very ballsy move and said, you know what? Marshall made his decision. Now let's see him enforce it. That's like insane. That basically the Supreme Court just checked the other two branches. They checked Congress's ability to pass the Indian Removal Act and Jackson being able to, enforce it because he's the leader of these armed troops. So John Marshall's trying to check the other two branches, and Jackson just goes, okay, don't have to listen to you, and kept going. So we seemingly just ignored a check and balance, and he got away with it. The second issue on the table is the nullification crisis. So remember, as a Democratic Republican, his point of view is very pro states' rights. Now, that tariff of abomination, that tariff of 1828 that was passed under John Quincy Adams right before Andrew Jackson, when Andrew Jackson was elected, the Southern Democratic Republicans were like, yes, our man, Andrew Jackson, got elected. He's going to repeal that for us. Because, of course, he's one of us. He doesn't like tariffs either. But Jackson isn't super keen on getting rid of it. That's not his priority. And he's actually getting annoyed with some of the more vocal Southerners like John Calhoun in South Carolina. John Calhoun will become a very big power player in the next unit when we talk about the like secession of the South, because John Calhoun is sometimes called the mouth of the South or Crazy Calhoun, very outspoken person in Congress about this tariff. And Jackson is actually getting more peeved at him for getting so combative towards the federal government about this tariff rather than just getting rid of the tariff. And so if it had to come down between states' rights and disunion between, between the states and the federal government, Jackson is going to pick the federal government. Like, he's going to go to preserving the union instead of just giving the states whatever they want. So when John Calhoun and other Southern states go so far as to declare nullification, to bring up that idea again. And if you remember, that was an idea first promoted by Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, when they said John Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, and therefore they should be able to make them null and void, meaning that they should just be able to ignore them as states. This idea came up again, and we're seeing this as a Southern way of like potentially solving their problems. But Andrew Jackson sees that as treason. And he even goes to Congress and asks them to pass what's called the Force Bill, that would grant him the use to use military against his own states in order to force them to pay the tariff. Now, it didn't come to that because Henry Clay, the great compromiser of history, the guy who wrote the Missouri Compromise, American System, the Krupp Bargain, he proposes a lower tariff. So this whole thing kind of got resolved just with that a little bit, but it had some interesting precedents being set. Now we see the issue of nullification coming back up. So we're seeing that nullification as a potential solution when you don't like what the federal government does being used again, and it'll keep being used again in the next unit because it looked like it worked. Like the South threw a tantrum and got something that it wanted because of threat and nullification. But then we're also seeing the precedent that the federal government, the president, was going to use force against the states if they were being disobedient. So the two big things that are going to come to a head in the next unit in the Civil War. So the third and final issue under Andrew Jackson is going to be the fact that he killed the National Bank. So your book mentions the Panic of 1819 earlier in period 4. So I just wanted to explain like why, as context, why that's related to this, just so you guys can get the full story. So the Panic of 1819 that occurred earlier, some people think that it could have been based on the bank. A panic just means a dip in the economy. It's nowhere near a depression. We have plenty of panics throughout history. They usually work themselves out, but it does, the economy does take a hit, and people are attributing it possibly to the bank because the bank is giving away loans to businesses, even farmers. But the problem is the bank started to call back a lot of its loans at once, and people were not able to pay them back right away, which led to, the banks becoming a little unstable, hence why the economy got a little shaken. And so what happened under Andrew Jackson is that the bank was about to expire its charter, because when it was first created by Alexander Hamilton, it was granted a charter, which was a temporary existence, essentially. And then with Henry Clay's American System, it got rechartered. It was technically the second bank of the United States. And so I mentioned Nicholas Biddle as the president of the bank, just in case you see a primary source from Biddle that you can associate Biddle with bank and bias, like Biddle bank bias. So Henry Clay is asserting that he's supporting Biddle, that we should recharter the bank. Andrew Jackson should grant the rechartering of the bank. But like all Democratic Republicans, Andrew Jackson believes that the bank is an elitist institution. It's unconstitutional, and just like Thomas Jefferson said, there's nothing in the Constitution that granted Alexander Hamilton the right to make it, or Henry Clay the right to make it. And so he vetoes it. He kills the national bank. He basically crumbles it. And then all the funds that were in the national bank, he sprinkled into a bunch of what people call pet banks, which are just more local state banks that are more likely to give loans to, small town folk, which is 100% true. Now we'll talk about, how this could potentially have affected the economy in later parts of the next unit. The specie circular, I don't mind if you guys know that for right now. Well, the only time that we really emphasize the importance of using gold as currency versus greenbacks or like paper money, we'll talk about that in period 6 when we talk about the Gilded Age, because that is one of the most significant issues on the table based on like it split the two political parties in the regions. So Andrew Jackson was such a controversial figure that he single-handedly recreated the two-party system. And forevermore, we will always have the two-party system. Some might even argue that we had it, even though the Federalists were not a formalized party with the name because they disbanded, but they were still present. But we have the official two-party system, on a ballot with names, like as like a organization back. However, the names changed. So Democratic Republicans just dropped the Republican term and are just now Democrats. So those are the anti-federalists who turned Democratic Republicans, who are like Jackson, Southern, agricultural based, less power to the federal government, Democrats. And people that were kind of on the side of Henry Clay, those Democratic Republicans who used to be Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, are now Whigs. And it kind of makes sense. Again, if you think of the names, Democrat means power to the people. Whigs, when I think of Whig, I think of like those powdery wigs that are on like hoity-toity people. So it makes sense that like the elitist industrial people in New England, are the ones that are calling themselves Whigs. Also kind of funny and ironic because they're the people who support Great Britain. And when I think of Parliament, I think of those Whigs too. So the names kind of make sense when you really think about it. Now, I mentioned here that the next election of 1836, Democrat Martin Van Buren wins. The only reason I say that is because the next election is 4 years later. And so I don't want you guys to look at the timeline and be like, wait, what, did I miss something? I mean, we really will never talk about Martin Van Buren. There's several presidents that we do not really get into because nothing super significant happens in their presidencies. But this is the third major election of Unit 4, but also that the third of the 4 elections within the first semester that you will need to know. So why is the election of 1840 so pivotal, especially when you look at the names? And I highly doubt a lot of you guys have even heard of those people. So you have Martin Van Buren running again as Democrat. You have 2 Whigs on the ballot, William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. Now, we don't really care about necessarily who became a president. It's how they became a president. William Henry Harrison was seemingly winning because of his tactics, this popular campaigning that occurred. You guys are so probably just used to it in modern time that you guys are used to the endless debates, the traveling around the country, them on social media, on TV, the commercials, all this stuff, like the signs in the yard. That was not the norm back then. You did not have to cater to all these people. But you have William Henry Harrison literally parading a log cabin down the roads of the United States to talk about how he grew up kind of like Andrew Jackson, just like one of you guys. Like, I was born in a log cabin. I'm not, one of those elitists in the North. He passed out alcohol and buttons because he wanted to be seen as, relatable. He made up slogans like Martin Van Ruin, like for Martin Van Buren, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe meaning, because William Henry Harrison was a successful general in the Battle of Tippecanoe that I mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint. So it's supposed to be like Tippecanoe and Tyler too, like I'm gonna tip Tyler or something. So, not the most clever things, but this was unheard of. The level that people were going to. There's primary sources that you guys will look at in the, the 1DBQ activity. about the changes of elections and campaigns around the 30s and 40s. And there's one source from it's like David Crockett, where he's discussing like kiss babies, make promises you don't intend to keep, do anything you need to appeal to these people. But why? Like, why now? Why didn't they have to appeal to people before? Well, you have to think of it of the context of everything that just happened under Jackson. He pushed power to the people. He pushed universal white male suffrage. We just expanded the voter base by so many more people. And the demographic, regular folk, poor, uneducated, simple folk in the South, farmers. These are not the elitists. These are not other politicians. And so people got to change their campaign tactics to appeal to this new audience, this new wide audience of just the everyday man. And that will just never change. This election was the first signs that that change had officially begun. And ever since, we've had popular campaigning in every election. Now, William Henry Harrison does win, probably because of all these tactics. He's also just famous for winning a month after he's inaugurated because he didn't wear a coat to his inauguration and died of a cold. So, I mean, he's famous for that. So John Tyler then becomes president. So I highly recommend that you use the Jacksonian Democracy DDQ investigation for a couple reasons. One, it was the DDQ on the exam, I believe it was either 2013 or 2015. So you can see like a more recent DDQ that was used. It gives you a little bit of a review from just Jackson in general. Gives you a sneak peek at some of the common primary sources that are associated with Jackson that you might see on a DDQ or an SAQ. Or in the stimulus-based multiple choice, but then also just to practice the claim evidence reasoning in there. So I think that's a really good resource for you to review not only DDQ skills, but Jacksonian democracy as well. So then this next part, this DDQ writing workshop was a second DDQ, a very popular one that came out of this time period, which was the one I mentioned earlier about the changes. It says, explain the ways that participation in political campaigns and elections in the United States changed between 1815 to 1840. And so I gave you guys the DDQ planning sheet and this DDQ, which again, I can't remember which one is which one was 2015 and 2013 between these two DDQs between these times, but they're both great review DDQs to, again, review the content, get familiar with some very popular primary sources that could be on your assessments for our unit test or for the AP exam. But then also, these are some of the big ideas that come out of this time period. So if you feel confident that you can speak about both of those prompts, then you're in pretty good shape. Okay, so if you guys remember way back in Unit 2, we learned about the First Great Awakening about 100 years prior to what we're talking about now. And the First Great Awakening was a religious movement in reaction to the Enlightenment that was trickling over from Europe and making its way over. And people started to question the Bible, try to question the idea of predestination, and trying to use logic and reasoning to look at the world instead of just religion. And so the religious folks are pushing back, saying, no. Nope, church matters. You got to go to church. And the First Great Awakening was trying to promote people going back to church, partially by scaring them back, but also trying to loosen the ties of the church by saying, we don't believe in predestination anymore. What you do on earth matters. You need to work hard every day to be a good person. So you got to go to church. You got to be a good citizen. You got to be a good Christian. So now we're getting into the Second Great Awakening, literally 100 years later. So it's in the 20s, 30s, another religious revival. It's basically the same thing. Protestantism is making a comeback with the Second Great Awakening, and it's a lot of the same causes and a lot of the same effects. Like we see, some people just becoming less involved in the church, and we're trying to get people to come back to the church. We have expanding of Enlightenment ideals after the revolution, and it's being reflected in state constitutions. So people are just kind of straying from the church even more. But again, the effects are very similar to what we said with the First Great Awakening. There was this democratization of religion because it allowed people to have more of a say in their religion, and how that could be transferred to other areas of life, like a say in politics. Second Great Awakening does the exact same thing. It's kind of actually also partially caused by that expansion of democracy. The fact that people in the Jacksonian era feel like they have more power, it gives them more motivation and more of a confidence to feel like that they can take their religion in their own hands. So yeah, it's very reminiscent of the First Great Awakening, and a lot of similar causes and effects. What's different about this one is that we're seeing a lot of new types of religions, not just different sects of Christianity, but just other different religions in general. We're seeing more Baptists and Methodists in the South. We're seeing Mormonism, or also known as the Church of Jesus Christ or Latter-day Saints, founded by Joseph Smith, being created, which is later moved to Utah just because they were trying to escape persecution. They go out west. That's why a lot of modern day Mormons are located in Utah, because they've been there ever since, the 1800s. They were led out there by Brigham Young. Catholics are being outcasted in the United States. That's not new, because again, their allegiance is being questioned if they're going to be more allegiant or more loyal to the Pope in Europe versus the president in the United States. And it also doesn't help that there's a high correlation between Catholics in the United States and the German and Irish immigrants. And we'll get into the racism that the German and Irish will face in the next unit. Jewish people are still discriminated against. Millennialism is another religion that's coming out during this time that believes in this kind of doomsday mentality. Makes me think of that Parks and Rec group. Now, the last thing that's part of this unit is this wave of antebellum reforms in the 1840s. Now, I stressed this in class, but the College Board will not necessarily sit there and require you to memorize every reformer, everything they did. We want to give you a wide range of people and things to know. Like we want you guys to know the gist that there were, temperance reforms, there were abolitionists, there were education reforms. But if you can remember some specific folks by name and use those as evidence in your writing, that's kind of the ultimate goal. Because if you try to stretch yourself thin and try to remember every single term that goes along with you're probably less likely to remember any of them. Rather than just getting more focused on a couple key individuals that you can understand pretty well and just use those in your back pocket as evidence in your argumentative writing. So what does antebellum means? Well, ante means before and bell means war. So this is the name that was retroactively given to this era after the Civil War. So before the Civil War era, there was this huge wave of reform, diverse amounts of reform, a lot of different motivations, and a lot of different goals. But a lot of the motivations that we're going to kind of characterize in this list. You have that idea, that old Puritan sense of mission that's mentioned in your book. All that means is that ever since the United States was founded by Puritanism, like in New England, our country has always had this idea of duty. Like we've always felt like we've had a duty to do something, whether that's, just like sticking up for ourselves and having the revolution and revolting, or, sticking up for the common people, whatever it is. Our country just has this value of having a sense of mission and purpose. The Enlightenment ideas that we can create a better society, we can rationalize through issues, people are born good. This idea that the whole Jacksonian democracy, putting power in the hands of everyday people, it's everyday people doing these reforms, not the federal government. So these people are inspired because they feel empowered. And there have been so many changes between the different genders, races, and classes because the industrial and the market revolution, that some people didn't really benefit as much as others. And so they're trying to address those inequalities. And the Second Great Awakening will spark this moral obligation in people to try to save their souls by helping others. So in class, we're going to do a reformer speed dating activity where you're all assigned a folk to be for the day, just in order to help everyone fill out their other person cards about the different types of reformers, the goals, motivations. these are the ones that we focused on, the reformers that we focused on in that class activity. So we try to whittle down the lengthier list of people and organizations to these. So if you had to focus on some, I would focus on, these folks. So your book, an earlier topic mentioned utopian experiments. So I just wanted to touch base on those for a second. With all the new lands going out west, some people took it upon themselves to break away from society. Utopian means to create a perfect model society. And with the industrialization and the market revolution, some people didn't like the way that the country was moving. They believed that industrialization and market revolution and that like birth of more modern capitalist ideas was creating like greed and a sinful society. And so you have these different types of groups moving out west to create their version of utopia. So you have like Brook Farm, where that's where you kind of see some like, it's like more of a like artistic sort of safe haven. Transcendentalists are out there. Then you have this New Harmony, which is a non-religious, socialistic, so very communal, one. The Oneida Community by John Humphrey Noyes in New York, which was all about like against like gender norms. It was very communal with a free love attitude, meaning like a non-commitment to a partner sort of thing. That's the most PC way I can say that. So you can see all these were just about more freedom of expression, because they felt that society was getting more and more rigid and possibly less free with all these changes. So some of the social reformers that were in this activity, you have the American Temperance Society. Temperance just means like prohibition, like abstaining from alcohol. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was also in there. Makes sense why women are pushing for that reform, because their husbands are the ones that are usually going out and getting drunk and coming home and disrupting the household if they drink too much. Dorothea Dix is famous for creating state-funded asylums for mentally ill people, because prior to that, they were just thrown in prison with everyone else and homeless people and vagrants and debtors and all this stuff. And so they weren't getting proper medical treatment. Now, another concern that's happening in the background is with this expansion of people's right to vote, that fear of the rule of the mob became even more so. Like, we're afraid that we have even more massive amounts of uneducated people voting. And that is the entire reason why we have public education today. Free education so we can have an educated voter base. It's the whole point of why you guys are sitting in high school right now. It would be the great equalizer to society. It would give everyone an equal opportunity to have social mobility. So again, in this idea of a very enlightened democratic nation, they saw everyone that got an equal opportunity to education, everything's fair game, and everyone would be more knowledgeable in voting. Horace Mann is the person who forwarded that with the creation of public schools. We have the McGuffey-Rear, the first ever textbook in the nation. I'm sure you guys are stoked about that. But it was not like what you guys think of textbooks. It was like moral things about like being like diligent and on time and things like that. And basic literacy was in there, but the public school system and these textbooks were 100% aimed at also getting these students ready for life in a factory. It was all about getting them ready for the workforce. We have a lot of abolitionist reforms that'll kind of lead us into the next unit. You have like William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote this really famous newspaper called The Liberator, which was very radical in demanding an immediate emancipation of slaves without any kind of compensation to the owners. Because you had like less radical people that said maybe we could pay for the slaves, pay for their freedom. William Lloyd Garrison was like, no, they should just be released now. He started the American Anti-Slavery Society, which will be a big abolitionist group that'll be in the next unit as well. Frederick Douglass is a very famous, this is a picture over here, freed slave, an escaped slave who wrote about his experiences in this journal called the North Star, which we'll talk about again in the next unit, because as Northerners are starting to hear firsthand accounts of slave practices, because they aren't totally aware of what's going on, it starts to create empathy for them. And that's what we'll talk about in the next unit. Harriet Tubman leading slaves through the Underground Railroad. And Nat Turner is another slave we'll talk about in the next unit. He leads a very, very bloody slave revolt that'll have a very significant impact on the road to the Civil War. And some of the last ones that we're talking about are the women's rights. So the cult of domesticity. So when you think cult, you think of like brainwashing, right? And domesticity, you see the word domestic. So this is like, they thought this is like the negative ideology of women brainwashed to thinking that they have to be tied to the home and that's all they're good for. So it's this ideology that women are in charge of child rearing and moral leaders of the home, but kind of like Republican motherhood, but like in a negative way. This is what women who did not like the Republican motherhood, did not like the expectation that that was the only thing that they were good for. That's what they called this, the cult of domesticity. And so there are a lot of famous women that are involved in the women's rights movement during this time. You have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, a very famous women's rights event, where they write this. It's essentially the list of grievances that women have. They basically rewrote the entire Declaration of Independence, and anytime they had the phrase men in there, they wrote "and women" after it. So like you see the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Bold statement, kind of to do that to the founding document of the country, to show how they were left out of it. And you have Susan B. Anthony, who pioneered the women's right to vote movement, the suffragist movement. What's also important to note, kind of like with the temperance movement I mentioned before, women are kind of the basis of a lot of these reforms. Not only women's rights, they're very involved in the abolitionists, temperance, public education, you see the asylums. And it's because women can empathize with all these other plights just because, they felt oppressed and are feeling the effects of a lot of these other issues, that they're the ones who are really picking up the slack and trying to get a lot of this stuff passed. So that is pretty much all of the main points, the biggest takeaways from all of topic 4. So please reach out to me if you guys have any questions. But if you guys feel confident answering all those questions on your period topic guide and with the vocab terms that were at least mentioned on this PowerPoint, then you guys are in great shape. So reach out to me if you have any questions, and good luck with period 4.